Hello again, this is Alister McGrath, continuing this series of short presentations introducing Christian theology. And you'll remember that in the previous presentation we looked at some aspects of the Christian understanding of God, including the idea that God is creator of heaven and earth. And this idea of God as creator is of major importance in the Old Testament. And although the idea is especially associated with the first two chapters of the book of Genesis, actually we find it in all three of the major types of Old Testament writings: the historical, the wisdom, and the prophetic literature. So what does it mean to talk about creation? What does it mean to talk about God as creator? Well, in this presentation I'm going to look at this idea of creation and see how we might be able to make sense of it. Because clearly it really helps to be able to visualize this in some way. Now, theologians have developed several models or ways of picturing the creation. Let's look at two of these ways of thinking about how God can be thought of as creating the world. These are analogies. All analogies are weaknesses, but they are helpful in casting lights on the complex and rich Christian understanding of the idea of creation. Here's the first of them. God, it can be thought of as an architect or a builder who constructs the world. Now, that idea I think is really helpful in some ways. It brings out, I think, the ideas of purpose, planning, and perhaps also a deliberate intention to create. In other words, the image highlights the skill and the wisdom of the creator, and it allows the beauty and the ordering of the resulting creation to be appreciated, both for what is in itself, but also as a testimony or a witness to the creativity and the wisdom of its creator. And this way of visualizing creation helps to make the important theological point that the creator is somehow exemplified, as God's character is in some way expressed in the created order itself. So we turn to a second way of thinking about this. This is the idea of creation as artistic expression. And again, it's a very familiar analogy, and many of us will find it very, very intuitively plausible. Many Christian writers from various periods in history of the church speak of creation as the handiwork of God, comparing it to a work of art, perhaps a sculpture or a painting, which is both beautiful in itself, as well as expressing the personality or the character of its creator. And this idea of creation as the artistic expression of God is, I think, particularly well expressed in a North American theologian, Jonathan Edwards, who spoke much about the beauty of creation and the way in which this is God's artistic handiwork. But you also find it in Dorothy L. Sayers' famous work of 1941, The Mind of the Creator, where she compares God to a novelist who in effect creates a world of imagined realities. So what difference does the doctrine of creation make? What are the implications of this idea of creation? Well, let me note several lines of exploration. The first of them is that the idea of God creating the world means that we need to draw a distinction between God and the creation. The creation is not divine, it's made by God. And a major theme of Christian theology from the earliest of times has been to resist the idea of merging creator and creation. They are different. And it's a very important theme in Paul's letter to the Romans, the opening chapter of which criticizes the human tendency to reduce God to the level of the world. According to Paul, there's a natural human tendency as a result of sin to serve created things rather than the creator. So Christian theology thus distinguishes God from the creation. They're not the same, while at the same time affirming that this is God's creation. They are not the same, God and creation, but there's a clear link between them. Secondly, the idea of creation affirms that human beings are part of the created order. And that means that we have special responsibilities within it and towards it. Because you see, the doctrine of creation leads to the idea of human stewardship of the creation, which is to be contrasted with the more secular notion of human dominion over the world, so we can do with it as we please. You see, the creation is not ours, and we hold it in trust for God, and we're called to care for it. We're meant to be stewards of God's creation, and we are responsible for the manner in which we exercise this stewardship. Now, as I think you can see, this insight is of major importance in relation to ecological and environmental concerns, in that it provides a theoretical foundation for the proper exercise of human responsibility towards our planet. Let's turn then and look at a third aspect of the doctrine of creation, namely that the doctrine of God as creator implies the goodness of creation. And throughout the first biblical account of creation, we encounter the affirmation, and God saw that it was good. Incidentally, the only thing that's not good is that Adam was alone. The point is that humanity is created as a social being and is meant to exist in relation with others. But the point I want to make here is that the Gnostic idea of the world as an inherently evil place isn't a Christian idea. The world remains God's good creation and is capable of being redeemed. And I think is a very important point. As C.S. Lewis says, God likes matter. After all, he made it. So we need to remember the world is not evil. Fallen does not mean evil. Now, I've already made the point that a Christian understanding of creation affirms that humanity is part of the created order. But that's not the full picture. We also need to make it clear there's something distinct about humanity within the created order. Humanity, if you like, is being created in the image of God, an idea we find in Genesis 1:27. And that means that humanity has a relationship with God which is different from that of other creatures. For some theologians, the idea that humanity bears the image of God is a statement of the privileged position of humanity within creation. But for me, and I think for most Christian theologians, the idea of bearing God's image is an affirmation of human responsibility and accountability towards the world in which we live. To bear God's image is to be responsible for the created order which has been entrusted to us. Now, of course, there's a lot more that does need to be said about this very interesting idea of the image of God. Some theologians, for example, see the image of humanity bearing the image of God, expressing the idea of human rationality, especially the idea that we can somehow discern God in the natural world because it's God's creation. And we see this in Augustine of Hippo, who wrote these words, which I think are really interesting. He writes, "The image of the Creator is to be found in the rational or intellectual soul of humanity. The human soul has been created according to the image of God in order that it may use reason and intellect in order to apprehend and behold God." So that's one way of thinking about humanity bearing the image of God. But you can see this idea in other very interesting ways. Some, for example, C.S. Lewis, see the image of God expressed in the created human capacity to relate to God. And for Lewis, there's a God-shaped gap within us which only God is able to fill. And in God's absence, we experience a deep sense of longing, a longing which is really for God, but which we attach to things within the world, which then fail to meet our deepest yearnings. And Lewis's point is, if we're made for God and God alone, then there's just nothing else that's going to satisfy us. Now, let me mention one important theological theme which is linked with the idea of creation, and that is natural theology. Again, natural theology. And the concept of natural theology is open to many interpretations within Christian theology, but the basic idea is that there's a link between God the Creator and the creation, that is, the observable world of nature which is God's creation. Think of Psalm 19:1. "The heavens declare the glory of God. The heavens proclaim the work of God's hands." So, if God created the world, what may be known of God from that natural world, which again is God's creation? And there are many who would argue that something of the wisdom of God who made the world can be known through the created order. Now, it's a complex debate, but I think it highlights some of the very rich possibilities that are opened up by seeing the natural world as God's creation. Now, there is a lot more that needs to be said about a theology of creation. But I think it's time to move on. We're now going to move on and look at the whole area of Christology. That is to say, the Christian understanding of the identity and the significance of Jesus Christ. We'll look at ideas like incarnation, like salvation. What does it mean to say God, that Christ is Saviour? So it's going to be really interesting, and I look forward to speaking to you again very soon.